yes, I have a generic started in my parents' garage story. There were times where I almost quit entirely. I just stopped believing the dream was possible, and I kind of just slowly gave up. I kept getting better and better, where I'm able to design the pieces that you see within Mythic today. This will be most valuable if you're looking to get into the jewelry business, but you might be able to extrapolate this to like any other kind of business, and maybe the lessons I learned within the jewelry game can help you in some other field. I go by Zoz here on YouTube, and I'm the founder of the jewelry company Mythic. Kind of hard to believe, but I'm coming up on 7 years of experience, and I've had a lot of ups and downs within that time. Learn from my failures so you can find success that much quicker. I failed so you don't have to. Damn. Anyways, I've also compiled a list of tips at the end of the video to help make your journey easier, so stick around for that. Make sure I'm like perfectly framed. I don't have OCD, you have OCD. To be honest, I can't remember exactly why I started making jewelry. If I can remember correctly, I had recently inherited a couple pieces from my grandma, and these were nice pieces, like real gold, stones, all that. And I'm also into hip hop, so this was super hype, you know, getting my own real gold jewelry. And I think I wanted to expand the collection, but then I realized how expensive that shit is. I thought basically the only way to get more of this, like the only way to expand my collection, is to just make it myself. And I bought the necessary equipment in order to make my first pieces through an ancient technique called sand casting. So like most things, the most difficult part was getting started. Casting is a pretty delicate process, and it took me weeks just to be able to get the silver to flow all the way around in order to make a complete ring. I kept getting half rings over and over again. I couldn't for the life of me get the silver to actually just flow and make a full ring. Until finally, I got this. This is the first actual piece of jewelry I ever made. I still have it to this day as a reminder of my beginnings. So then I expanded my tool set, most notably a Dremel. Having a rotary tool is, in my opinion, one of the most impactful upgrades you can make as a jeweler, or any sort of related craftsman that works with metal or small things, because a rotary tool is so insanely versatile. So then I started experimenting with my new tools in order to create more intricate pieces. This is another piece I still have from this time. It's this lunar surface ring. I made this with brute force by using a ball burr and just drilling a bunch of holes in the already casted metal, like the smooth surfaced ring I cast. This is like the most inefficient way you could possibly go about doing this, but you know, I didn't know better at the time, and I learned something, so that's all that matters, right? And I got a cool ring out of it, so I mean, come on. So then I kept experimenting more and more, and I even bought other pieces of jewelry that I could use as molds. So basically, I would buy some cheap jewelry because I like the shape of it, and then I would use those as a mold and then cast them in actual silver and gold sometimes too. I remember I even used a shark tooth that I had since I was a kid, and I used that as a mold and casted it into solid sterling silver. It was pretty sick. It was like a shark tooth necklace, but the actual tooth was silver. I'd never seen that before. I don't know if that's a thing or not, but feel free to take that idea. I worked at a store that sells shark tooth necklaces, and they're super popular, so I imagine that, you know, a silver one could also be a really popular idea. The next major milestone in my journey was discovering a piece of CAD software called Rhino. And if you're not familiar with CAD, it stands for Computer Assisted Design, I think. Computer Aided Design. You get the point. This was my first big investment. It cost me about $700 for Rhino 6 at the time. This software would allow me to create a lot more things, but I really had to lock in and learn this new piece of software. Learning software is pretty difficult and complex, and so that's something I really had to stay patient with and dedicate myself to learning. So although learning software is a real challenge, mastering software gives you so much potential. So after I'd model an object, you couldn't really sandcast it unless you had a 3D printer. So I would send off the model to a company called Shapeways, and they would cast my models for me. During this time, I was really into making fantasy jewelry. I modeled a bunch of video game inspired pieces, and that's actually how I started getting my first sales. Specifically weapons like war axes and swords and stuff. This whole time, I was listing stuff on Etsy, like the lunar/moon ring that I talked about earlier, but I feel like it was a little bit too random considering that I hadn't really made a name for myself yet. So I'm sure like someone eventually would have found that cool and bought it, but because I was making video game inspired stuff, people were sort of already inherently interested in that, and so I think that just brought a lot more eyeballs to my work. But a big limitation to Rhino and CAD software in general is that it's not ideal for complex organic shapes, which is what I really wanted to do. After all, CAD software isn't made necessarily for jewelry making. You know, it's usually for industrial things, much more rigid in shape, like machinery, bolts, I don't know, much more like smooth surfaced stuff. If you couldn't tell, like my whole brand image is very complex surfaces. So having something designed for smooth surfaces wasn't really panning out to what I wanted. At the end of the day, CAD software follows rigid mathematical models and is therefore kind of limiting if you want to do other stuff. But then Rhino 7 was announced, and this was like a godsend and couldn't have made better timing. It introduced a feature that would set me on the path that I'm on now. That feature was called sub-D modeling. Sub-D stands for subdivision. Instead of modeling with mathematical parameters, I mean, I guess it still technically is math, but it doesn't feel like it per se. Because sub-D allows you to take the actual polygons of the model, which are basically just like the little shapes that make up a bigger shape. So you're able to push and pull those polygons, like literally just with your mouse. So you don't have to predefine certain parameters that it has to follow, if that makes sense. Basically, it was just a way more organic way of modeling. But while this was ideal for organic shapes, it wasn't ideal for complex shapes. So basically, if you divide, say this was made up of 4 squares, obviously you'd get no detail like the ridge there. And so you would have to keep dividing the number of faces that make up this object. So say there's like 200 little squares that make up this shape, then you'd probably have enough detail to where you could cut a groove in there. Hopefully that makes sense. But the problem is, as you keep dividing to get more detail, the model just becomes unworkable in a lot of ways, both in terms of performance and also you're just going to get poor surfaces because there's so much detail. It's impossible to really manage all of that. Nonetheless, this was a huge upgrade in my workflow, so I quickly cashed out the few $100s for the upgrade to Rhino 7. The next major milestone in my journey was switching up my type of casting, or in my opinion, upgrading my type of casting. This is another ancient technique called lost wax casting. So unlike sand casting, where you basically push the mold into the sand and then you pour the metal into that cavity, with lost wax, you take a mold made out of wax and then you pour plaster over it so that it completely engulfs the wax model. And then in a furnace, you burn out the wax so it just leaves that 3D cavity, and then you pour your metal into there. And that actually sounds kind of similar, but the reason it's so much better is because with sand casting, you're limited to like up and down, basically, because you have to press the mold into the sand. Lost wax casting, you burn out the wax, so you're able to get detail in every axis. Basically, it just allows you to do a lot more. And of course, this upgrade in equipment also had to include a 3D printer. Therefore, I could just print my own molds now. So having all this equipment myself allowed me to have full control over things, and this just made things a lot quicker because I didn't have to wait for castings and I could just do it all myself right away. Plus, this allowed me to experiment with things because of that speed, so I was able to like test things out and not worried about spending money and getting a result back that I didn't want. So all this time, I was still using the CAD software Rhino in order to create all my molds, and it was working, but let's just say that I was only getting by. I always felt limited, or like there was a ceiling to my creativity. Like I had ideas that were cut short because they were limited by the tools I was using. And I'm sure there might have been a way to get closer to that creativity I actually wanted to be at, but I don't know. I just really wasn't a fan of the process. You know, don't get me wrong. Some people like the more methodical, mathematical, rigid structural approach to things, but I don't know. I always wished it was more fluid and natural. And then I discovered a piece of beautiful software called ZBrush. It is the love of my life. Like, I'm not even playing. ZBrush is chef's kiss. A chef's kiss can't even do it justice. I swear. This was when the game completely changed for me. Now I wasn't limited to those rigid mathematical constraints. Unlike Rhino, even within sub-D modeling, where you can technically push and pull the polygons to create a shape that you want, ZBrush allows you to sculpt with the polygons in a way that it's a digital clay. So you go about sculpting pretty much just like you would with real clay. ZBrush allows you to constantly remesh, so once you have too many polygons in a model, you can just remesh it, and basically it eliminates all the bad stuff, so you can just keep on sculpting. And you can just repeat that process over and over again, so it removes that barrier of the computer, or at least like what feels like that barrier. So it literally almost feels like you remove the computer screen and you're putting your hands through it and sculpting with real clay. And because of this, you can sculpt this digital clay however you want. I love this software. It's really complicated and notoriously difficult to work with, but I didn't care. I could see the benefit, I could see the vision. I dove headfirst into the software. I was so set on it, in fact, that I made my biggest purchase within this whole business to date. Hey guys, this is post-edit. I'm realizing I got my chronology mixed up with all of this. The Lost Wax casting equipment I mentioned earlier was by far the most expensive. That's like the biggest wall into getting into real jewelry making. And don't get me wrong, you can definitely get by with sand casting or just outsourcing your casting in general. But if you want to do it, it's going to be pretty costly. It's going to be at least $1,000 to get the right equipment, and if you want to like invest in good equipment, it's going to cost even more than that. I would personally recommend to do what I did, and that was just wait till you accumulate enough sales until you can actually upgrade your equipment and you're actually financially ready to do that. And in the meantime, just outsource your casting, or if you make simpler designs, if that's your thing, just continue with sand casting. Maybe you don't even need to upgrade. You know, this was just my personal path, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's the right one. And that was $1,000 ZBrush course. And that sounds like a lot of money. And at first I wrote it off because it is a lot of money. You know, I was like, the hell? Like, I can just learn from YouTube. Why would I pay $1,000 for a course? That's ridiculous. But the education was top tier. Like, this is university level stuff. So if you compare it to university prices, it's a fraction of that. If you're curious, the course is ZBrush Jewelry Workshop, and it's taught by Tomas Wittelsbach. And this guy is responsible for pretty much all my sculptural knowledge. And he's the guy that made it possible for me to be able to do literally all of this. Like, literally all of this. Without learning from him, I honestly, I don't even know where I'd be. Like, my stuff would be mid-tier at best, honestly. Maybe I could have learned more slowly, but the fundamentals, like, this guy's a real sculptor, and so the fundamentals that he taught were ingrained within me in a way that just allowed me to really sculpt like a professional. And so as I kept practicing that, I actually became more professional with the results I was getting, because I was using a professional process, you know? So hopefully that makes sense. So anyways, I kept getting better and better at ZBrush or sculpting to the point where I'm able to design the pieces that you see within Mythic today. So interestingly, like, the way I tell this story in hindsight, it sounds like it was just a constant path upward. You know, like, I hit this milestone and this milestone and everything was up, but that actually wasn't the case at all. There were times where I almost quit entirely. And the most major example of that was when, I think it was before I found the CAD software. But basically, I just stopped believing the dream was possible, and I kind of just slowly gave up. And it wasn't until I visited my friend who knew what I was doing, and he just kind of casually mentioned it, you know, that I'm a jeweler. And I was like taken back by that, because I kind of stopped identifying with it. And yeah, he just casually mentioned it, and I was like, oh shit, like, am I really a jeweler? Hey guys, post-edit again. I just wanted to clarify here that what I'm trying to say is that it took someone else believing in me in order to believe in myself, really, and keep going. And so when I got back home, I decided that, yes, I'm going to do this for real. So the next major milestone was actually filing for an official registered business. So I filed for an LLC. This was actually much less intimidating than I thought because I paid a couple $100 for a company to do it all for me. That company was Zen Business. Afterward, which I learned I probably should have just done it myself anyways, because even if you file your own paperwork, it's not really that intimidating. If I were to do it again, I'd probably just save myself the couple $100 and file it myself. There's like plenty of tutorials on YouTube how to do that in your particular state. But either way, it's not nearly as big of a deal as I thought it would be. But that doesn't mean that you should just willy-nilly file for a business. You should be pretty certain that this is what you're gonna do, because there's fees associated with it and other legal stuff that you probably shouldn't just jump straight into. You should definitely be sure that you're creating a business in the area you really want to do it within, and ultimately be sure that you're committed to it. But on the other hand, don't let that lead to analysis paralysis, because I think the most important step into doing anything is starting. Like I said at the beginning of the video, that's the hardest part for most things. So you can actually sell stuff on Etsy. You don't really need a business in order to get started doing business. So yeah, I think Etsy is a good place to start if you're within that dilemma. But Etsy has a lot of problems, so I definitely wouldn't think about that long term. I would think of it only as a means to get started, and then maybe in the future as a supplement to your actual business and your actual website. All right, so we're current now. Social media. This was one of my biggest areas of improvement and something that has given me the most drastic results, but something that I was probably the most scared of, period, in this whole journey. So I'm growing on major platforms like TikTok and YouTube in order to promote my business. I resisted this for a long time because I was scared to get in front of the camera. But social media is a necessary and crucial part of the game of running a business in the modern era. For example, while this video isn't an ad for Mythic, it still gets the word out and also acts as another stream of income for my business with YouTube's ad revenue, or at least it will when I reach 1,000 subscribers. And having this extra stream of income will act as a cushion for when there's a dip in sales. Certain seasons are better than others, while YouTube ad revenue can act as a stream of income to sort of cushion those dips and just generally make you more financially secure. All right, so here's a couple tips. These are like the most crucial things I've learned and probably the things that I would tell my younger self in order to speed up that whole journey that I just talked about. So a really important one is something I touched on earlier, and that's that I started getting my first sales with pieces that were inspired by things that were already popular. Like I said, that was jewelry inspired by particular video games. More specifically, like a sword necklace that was a specific sword from a popular video game. Riding a wave that people already know and love allows you to be found much easier. You don't have to form your brand image around this, but it brings eyeballs to the rest of your work. And those extra sales can hold you over until you start selling more of the work that you really want to do. Another tip is, if you know you're committed to this, like whatever it is you're starting, invest in quality tools. At the beginning, I bought a lot of crap that I just had to replace anyways, and so I ended up losing more money than I actually saved, buying cheaper stuff. If you're interested in the jewelry industry or metalworking in general, I plan to make a video about the specific tools that I think you should get. And even if you're just starting out, I'll compile a list of more affordable ones that are still good enough to get you through it and won't break on you in the middle of your work. So keep an eye out for that. I'll be making that soon. This one's going to sound pretty generic, but it's probably the most real tip out of all of them. And that's something I also touched on earlier. But if you want to do something, there's only one thing you got to do. That's start. And this is super easy to write off because everyone says that and it's like cookie cutter advice. But there's a reason it's such popular advice, because it works. It is literally the only way that you'll ever do something is if you start. And so don't worry about starting perfectly. Even if you go into something with a lot of knowledge, you're still going to be new at it and you're still going to suck regardless. So don't waste all that time trying to learn something before you start. Learn something after you start. Learn through the process. It's much more effective, and you'll actually start building that momentum that will allow you to keep on going, and you're gonna reach your goals way faster if you just start. Like, go in pretty much blind, you know? Like, this is a really important lesson that I learned. I used to blow it off too, like, oh yeah, whatever, generic advice. But through my own experience, like, damn, that is such real advice. Like, it's unbelievably simple, but unbelievably effective. So another tip is about learning too. If you have something intimidating to learn, like software especially, or anything that's intimidating you have to really like visualize the outcome you can get by learning this, and then decide that you want that outcome and really commit to learning it. You have to have an internal conviction that you're going to see this through, and that's what's going to push you through the long, frustrating parts of learning something, especially like software. And start by dedicating small amounts of time each day to learning what it is that you want to learn. This is going to ensure that, like, even if you don't want to do it, it's 10 minutes, you know? It's just 10 minutes. Do that. Usually after those 10 minutes, you'll probably just want to keep going. You're already in the thick of things and the wheels are already turning. It makes it much easier. But even if you want to stop after 10 minutes, 10 minutes is a lot more than 0. So yeah, if you have any questions or need advice or anything, I'm open to discussion in the comments, so drop one. And yeah, thanks for watching.